Greetings and welcome to the second installment of the interesting battle between the big blind and the Lowjack positions in no-limit hold'em poker. In this segment, our focus shifts towards unveiling fundamental flop strategies specifically tailored for the big blind and the Lowjack positions. We will delve into the intricate nuances of how both positions navigate diverse flop textures. This entails dissecting the specific scenarios, including a board favoring the Lowjack's raise first in RFI range, a neutral board representing an equilibrium, and a board strategically aligned with the big blind's calling range. Subsequently, we will engage in an insightful analysis of the ranges showcased throughout this presentation. As we draw towards the conclusion, we will take a moment to address the intricacies and limitations of the insights shared, followed by a concise recap of the key takeaways we've delved into. Before we proceed, let's take a moment to refresh our memory with the ranges presented in the previous video. A glance will reveal that the left-hand range highlighted in red shows the Lowjack's RFI range. Conversely, the range shown on the right represents the big blind's response for countering a Lowjack's RFI. The hands in green outline the big blind's calling range, creating a single raise pot dynamic. This strategy showcases the big blind's wide calling range when confronting the Lowjack's aggression. Every one of the subsequent scenarios has undergone analysis using a solver, employing the ranges previously presented. Our initial focus falls on a dynamic involving a wed and connected board, designed to better align with the Lowjack's RFI range. This flop consists of the ace of clubs, accompanied by the queen of diamonds and the jack of diamonds. The post-flop phase starts with a big blind position. In this particular scenario, the strategic approach adopted by the big blind is to check their entire range. The act of donking, which entails placing a bet against the initial aggressor before they have a chance to act, is generally considered suboptimal and is rarely, if ever, employed by good players. The rationale behind this stems from the challenge of maintaining balance when utilizing this tactic. Additionally, given the inherent positional disadvantage, donking can inadvertently divulge a substantial amount of information about our hand to our opponents. The better course of action involves implementing a check strategy that contains our entire range. By doing so, we create the opportunity to assess our hand's potential in light of the following actions from the Lowjack. This strategic choice not only preserves our range's balance, but also sets the stage for potential check-raise opportunities, as we will explore in the following analysis. Now, shifting our focus to the Lowjack's response to the big blind's check. On the ace, queen, jack board the Lowjack's approach involves checking around 28% of the time. 72% of the time, the Lowjack opts for a continuation bet, c-bet. Notably, when the c-bet is used, it tends to be of a smaller size. This decision is because the Lowjack holds a plethora of strong premium hands with significant potential. Conversely, the big blind's range often encompasses weaker, less favorable holdings that are only able to continue against a smaller bet. Note that the smaller size is used instead of a large size to charge draws. Charging draws is good with vulnerable hands, but when we consider a range versus range scenario, the Lowjack has a lot more stronger draws than the big blind. Upon closer examination, we observe a balanced blend of hands being c-bet at comparable frequencies. Given the circumstances, it is possible to execute c-bets across all hands at a frequency of 72%. However, if we do look at some specific sets or higher frequency c-bets, whereas middle and bottom pair holdings are subjected to a relatively lower frequency of c-betting. This is because sets unblock draws and can therefore fire c-bets more often as there are more hands available for the big blind to continue with. The bottom and middle pair holdings may want to reduce their c-betting frequency due to the fact being check-raised, and having to fold a lot of equity is bad for the Lowjack. After the Lowjack has made a small continuation bet, c-bet, this is the range that the big blind wants to employ. The big blind is looking to call around 44.5% of the time. As we can see, the hands the big blind wants to call with are mainly single pair hands and flush draws. The solver aims for balance here, not raising all the strong and nutted hands every time, so it mixes it up. We should also consider what future streets will look like. Any diamond, 10, or king will significantly alter the hand strengths. Depending on the cards we hold, this could apply to as many as 19 cards. In other words, approximately 38% of the time, the board will become very challenging to play on the turn. This underscores the importance of pot control. We don't want to build a large pot that we might be forced to fold with marginal made hands. For example, if the big blind has jacks, this hand can be complicated. Jacks create the bottom set on this board, and while this hand is strong enough to call down, it doesn't want to raise and narrow the Lowjack's range. In this scenario, the big blind is looking to fold 42.6% of the time. That constitutes a significant portion of hands that are ready to give up. As you can observe, all of the low pocket pairs are inclined to fold. They are often well behind the Lowjack's range and at best have only 2 outs to improve. Many low-suited hands are also folding, including bottom and middle pairs. This is because the made-suited hands do not have flush draws and remain susceptible to further c-bets on any turn card. It's worth noting that the suited hands continuing are primarily those with club suits due to the potential for backdoor equity. Lastly, the big blind aims to check raise, doing so with small bets 11.9% of the time and with large bets 1% of the time. We can overlook the 1% and simply opt for small raises across our entire raising range. The hands that should raise here are strong combo draws such as 10-9 and 10-8 suited. Most made straights like King 10 are raised, along with middle sets of queens. Suited King X of diamonds is also raised. Ace Queen, which is a top 2 pair, is raised occasionally, especially if it includes the ace of diamonds. This ace provides the option to bluff a front door straight on future streets. The final action for this line and board is how the Lowjack reacts to the big blind's check raise. Here we can see that the Lowjack wants to call 53.2% of the time. The hands being called are all the very strong made hands. The nuts, sets, and strong diamond draws. None of these hands are raised for balance. This will also help keep in the big blind's check raise bluffs, such as low-suited drawing hands that the Lowjack's range is ahead of. The remainder of hands are folded. Similar to the big blind, the low pocket pairs have slim chances against aggression and are easy folds, along with some weak bottom pair hands and non-suited draws. Most low-suited aces are folded as they will struggle to improve and are already behind a significant portion of the big blind's range in this line. There should be no raises in this line. Onto the second board now, consisting of the Queen of Hearts, 7 of Diamonds and the 3 of Spades. This board is aimed at being a neutral board, so let's see how the Lowjack and big blind react. Firstly, as before, the big blind wants to check 100% of their range over to the Lowjack. There isn't anything to add that wasn't covered on the previous flop. In this line on the Queen, 7, 3 board, the Lowjack wants to c-bet almost 100% of the time. This is known as a range bet and is because on a neutral board, the Lowjack's range is so much stronger than that of the big blind they want to c-bet all the time to apply pressure to marginal hands, and for balance, it makes sense to c-bet everything, strong and weak. This also puts the onus on the big blind to react correctly with the appropriate range, which is not easy. The Lowjack has now made a small c-bet 100% of the time. The range here is about how the big blind should react. The big blind wants to call 47.1% of hands. This primarily includes all marginal made hands, including pocket pairs and some infrequent draws. The big blind wants to fold 35.3% of the time against a Lowjack's small c-bet. This encompasses obvious fold situations, such as hands with no backdoor equity that have completely missed the flop. It also involves some low ace-X hands, mainly the offsuit ones, which may still be ahead but will struggle on most turns and rivers against aggression. The last option in this line is for the big blind to raise 17.6% of the time. A check raise from the big blind should involve all the sets, queens, sevens, and threes. 2 pair hands are also raised, along with top pair good kicker hands. Some lower drawing type hands are used to balance these strong hands and are therefore also raised when in the range, such as 6-5 and 5-4 suited. The final range we will examine for this board is how the Lowjack responds to the big blind check raise. Most of the time, the Lowjack is choosing to call. As you can see, this covers a significant portion of the available range. In 28.9% of instances, the Lowjack is folding against a big blind's raise. This primarily represents the bottom end of the Lowjack's range, which either holds minimal equity or has completely missed the flop. The Lowjack aims to raise a marginal amount, 4.7% of the time, primarily stemming from sets. The final board we will discuss consists of the 7 of Diamonds, the 10 of Hearts, and the 6 of Diamonds. This board is more likely to connect with the big blind's defending range. This is the first range where the solver suggests the possibility of dunk betting. As explained earlier, balancing this action is quite challenging, so it's advisable for the big blind to check their entire range to the Lowjack. If we, and our opponent, are playing perfect GTO, we want to check 95.4% of the time and dunk bet the remaining 4.6% of the time. In this scenario, the big blind has checked to the Lowjack, who in turn wants to check around 48.8% of the time. This higher checking frequency is related to the fact that the big blind can have a lot more stronger hands when compared to the previous flops. The Lowjack wants to c-bet small around 27% of the time and large around 24% of the time. As we can see from the range chart that most of the hands that are c-bet are evenly split between a large c-bet and a small c-bet. This will keep the sizing balanced and reduce the likelihood of any sizing tells being given off. All the sets are c-bet at 100% frequency. The top pair good kicker hands are also c-bet a lot of the time. Most overcards are c-bet, especially with diamond draws. Aces are not c-bet very often as they become a good hand to call down with versus the many single pair and drawing hands that the big blind will have in range. This board creates a much more dynamic action for the Lowjack, where they can utilize a larger sizing to put pressure on the big blind's marginal made hands. This is because a lot of turn cards will be scary for the big blind's marginal hands. Moving on to how the big blind should react versus a small Lowjack continuation bet. Firstly, the big blind is looking to call 55.5% of the time. This calling range consists of single pair hands, along with hands containing a 9 for a gut shot draw. The big blind wants to fold versus the small c-bet from the Lowjack around 27.8% of the time. This, as with all the other ranges, consists of hands that have very low equity and have completely missed the flop. Some hands with 2 overcards are also looking to fold, as they also have marginal showdown value and will not fare well against good aggressive players. Finally, for this range, the big blind is looking to raise the Lowjack small c-bet around 16.7% of the time. This raising range is primarily made up of sets, 2 pairs, and flush draws. Let's continue along this line and explore how the Lowjack is supposed to defend against a check raise after they initially make a small continuation bet. The calling range comprises approximately 64.8% of the Lowjack's hands. This range includes all made hands, as well as several draws. The folding range against a big blind's raise is around 30.2%. This range consists of weak overcards, such as king jack off, and lower disconnected aces that are not flush draws. The raising range against a big blind check raise is marginal, occurring only 5% of the time. This range, similar to the others, is primarily composed of sets. It also incorporates some ace and king x flush draws at a low frequency. Let's examine how the big blind will defend against a large continuation bet from the Lowjack on the flop with 7, 10, and 6 cards. In this scenario, the big blind aims to call and raise less frequently and fold more often. This adjustment is due to the larger bet size, resulting in worse pot odds. Therefore, the big blind doesn't need to continue as frequently to avoid being exploited. With a large c-bet from the Lowjack, here's the range the big blind should consider playing. The calling range comprises 47.3% of hands and, once again, includes single pair hands, 2 pairs, most flush draws, and overpairs. Notably, bottom set is now more often called than raised. This choice helps protect the checking range and exercises control over the pot on a dynamic board. The big blind is inclined to fold approximately 44% of the time against a large c-bet. Similar to before, the folding range should, and indeed does, encompass weak hands that have missed the board. Low pocket pairs should also be folded, given their inadequate odds to continue. Many of the ace-x hands that lack flush draws are also folded. The raising range for the big blind in this scenario is about 8.7%. It mainly consists of top and middle sets, along with a few flush draws. 8-5 suited is also raised the majority of the time, as it represents a strong combination draw with limited showdown value. This hand will readily capitalize on the potential to win the pot through fold equity. This will be the final range we explore in this video, focusing on how the Lowjack should respond when facing a check raise after making a large continuation bet. The Lowjack is aiming to call with 56.3% of their range. This selection includes all made hands and strong flush draws. The Lowjack should opt to fold approximately 43.2% of the time when confronted with a raise from the big blind. This portion mainly consists of hands that possess marginal equity and were initially c-bet as part of a bluff. The folding range also encompasses overcard hands, such as ace-queen and king-jack offsuit. As mentioned earlier, these hands are unlikely to perform well against skilled aggressive players, so it's advisable to fold them instead of engaging in a sizable pot. The raising range for the Lowjack is relatively limited in this context and can be disregarded. What we have here is a table outlining the various frequencies for the different lines presented in this video. First, let's examine the c-betting frequency of the Lowjack when the big blind checks to them. On the second neutral board, the Lowjack aims to c-bet across their range. However, when we compare this to the third board that favors the big blind, the c-betting percentage drops to around 50%. This gives us insights into how different flop textures impact specific ranges. Given that the Lowjack tends to c-bet more often than not, let's delve into the big blind's optimal responses. It's noticeable that the big blind intends to call the c-bet about 50% of the time, leaning more towards flops that favor the big blind and less on those that are advantageous for the Lowjack. Understanding when and at what frequency to call helps mitigate the vulnerability to relentless c-bets. The check-raise percentage remains relatively consistent across all flops, except for scenarios when the Lowjack employs a larger c-bet on the third board. Finally, the overview illustrates how the Lowjack should react to a big blind check-raise. In this context, the Lowjack is inclined to call slightly over half of the time, particularly when facing a check-raise against a small c-bet. It's worth noting that the Lowjack seldom employs a 3-bet on any flop, apart from the neutral one. This approach is influenced by various factors, including pot control, the desire to retain the big blind's bluffs, and maintaining balance within the calling range when encountering a check raise. These factors are intricate and require time to become comfortable with in poker. Before we summarize the information in this video, I want to mention some simple caveats regarding the provided information. The ranges displayed are for stacks that are 100 big blinds deep and are better suited for online 6-max games. The strategies discussed do not account for any rake, straddles, or additional posted blinds in the pot. These ranges are GTO and not exploitative. Adjustments need to be made based on the playstyle of our opponents. One basic example is that there is no point in c-betting flops with bluffs if the opponent has shown they will never fold. Conversely, if an opponent always fold, then we may as well c-bet every flop and take it down or check our nutted hands so that the opponent may catch up. Finally, the analysis provided is very basic. GTO sims take a lot of computing power for a complete analysis. The sims run for this video are very simple and are designed to give us a generally playing heuristic. That's it for this video. The summary of the covered information. We began with the preflop ranges anticipated in a GTO scenario for the big blind versus the Lowjack in a single raise pot. We subsequently examined specific lines for 3 distinct flops and analyzed the hands involved in calling or checking, folding, and betting or raising. To conclude, we compiled all the data into a table to provide an overview of the GTO frequencies we should utilize. I appreciate you watching this video and taking in all of the detailed information for a somewhat specific scenario. The insights gained here should contribute to enhancing your gameplay, whether you're in the Lowjack or the big blind position. Thank you once again for your support and keep an eye out for the upcoming installment where we delve into 3-bet pots on similar textures. Please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Best of luck at the tables, and remember to keep practicing and refining your poker skills.